I'm never much of a rule follower, but I don't think reading projects are really policed so that there are rules. But I did want to take part in Victober. So here's my take for my experiences so far. Hi BookTube, it's Kim at K Becker's Books. This is a video on my Mid Victober review. It's the middle of October, and October on BookTube is Victober, which we read Victorian literature, and there are prompts that I don't follow. Again, I'm a rebel. I currently am reading 2 Victorian novels, and I'm reading a 3rd novel which has Victorian characters in it. And what I wanted to do today was I did some research into each of the authors of the novels, and I wanted to offer some fun facts, hopefully quickly, about each of these 3 authors. The first book I'm reading for Victober, and this is also the first book for my couple of books book project, is Jane Eyre by Charlotte Bronte. Very quickly, Jane Eyre is the story of an orphan who was taken in by her mother's brother upon her mother and father's deaths. Her uncle subsequently dies, and she is left in the care of her aunt by marriage only. She is rejected and isolated and eventually sent off to boarding school, and her life develops from there. We all know, I think, the story of Jane Eyre. I'm not going to tell you the details. I'm also, I watched the movie a few years back, which I enjoyed, and I plan to do it again once I'm done with the book. But I hope to finish Jane Eyre in October and move on to my next book in my couple of books project, which is Wide Sargasso Sea by Jean Rhys. So let me tell you some fun facts about Charlotte Bronte really quickly. She was born on April 21st, 1816, and she died on March 31st, 1855. She was only 38 years old. She was one of 6 children, 5 girls and 1 boy. Maria, Elizabeth, Charlotte, Emily, Anne, and Branwell was the only boy. She attended a clergy's daughter's school. Her father was a clergyman at Cowan Bridge. The school in Jane Eyre is modeled after that boarding school, and she was miserable there. She had a miserable time. In 1831, she attended Miss Wooler's school, and that's where she met her lifelong friend Ellen Nussey. I'm actually referring to my notes. Jane Eyre was published in 1847, and it was an instant success. Her first novel, I think her first novel was The Professor, and nobody wanted it, nobody wanted to buy it. She rejected 3 marriage proposals before she married Arthur Bell Nichols. I believe he was a curate, or again, a clergyman. She married him at the age of 38, and it pissed off her best friend Ellen because they had a non-marriage pact. They were going to become spinsters together. And so she was 38 when she got married. She became pregnant almost immediately, but she and the baby died most likely from, let me see if I can pronounce this, hyperemesis gravidarum. It's basically severe morning sickness, and is also what Kate Middleton developed when she was pregnant. It's back in these days in the 1800s, there was no treatment for that, so she probably died of dehydration and or starvation, and her unborn baby also died. She survived all 5 of her children, even though she died so young. She couldn't stand teaching. She tried to be a governess and a teacher and hated teaching, even though she and her sisters had planned on opening a school. She was only 4.5 feet tall. That one I found really interesting. And each of her sisters, the 3 of them, Charlotte, Emily, and Anne, all had to use pseudonyms, male pseudonyms, because they were women in Victorian England. And much of Charlotte's narratives were based on her life and the type of family she grew up in, her experiences, and many of the experiences, at least in Jane Eyre, were very true to life. But they didn't think that they could be published with their own names, and it was just not accepted for women to aspire to being novelists or pretty much any type of career. So they all used pseudonyms. Those are some of the fun facts I found out about Charlotte Bronte, and each of these facts of these authors I just found on numerous online resources and websites. Encyclopedia Britannica was one I used, I think, for all three. I looked at articles and interviews with my last author that I'm going to tell you about. I looked at historical websites, so a bunch of different sources. Now, the next book I'm reading is a buddy read with Alba from Seriella, and we are reading this book over 2 months, so through Victober and into November, and this is George Eliot's Daniel Duranda. Alba and I both buddy read Middlemarch in March, and loved it. It's one of my favorite novels. Daniel Duranda was George Eliot's last novel, and this is the story of Gwendolen Harleth and the title character of Daniel Duranda. Gwendolen is a 20-something-year-old young woman who has lost her stepfather, and her mother and family go into poverty, or the business fails and they're starting to sink into ruin. So it starts off with Gwendolen's project, or her family's project, to get her married off to a successful man with a bunch of money. And Daniel Duranda, it's kind of a dual narrative, where for right now we're reading Gwendolen's story, and it will very soon introduce us to Daniel Duranda's story. So what did I know about George Eliot? I had already known that George Eliot is a pseudonym for Mary Ann Evans. She was born on November 22nd, 1819. She died on December 22nd of 1880 at the age of 61. George Eliot was, again, a pseudonym, and I'll tell you how she thought of that down below. She was the editor of a progressive journal called the Westminster Review in the early 1850s. She was a German translator. She translated German works of literature. She didn't like women writers, but she admired Charlotte Bronte and Elizabeth Gaskell. And Elizabeth Gaskell is an author I still have yet to read, and I have a few of her books here. Henry James called George Eliot magnificently ugly, deliciously hideous. Now, she actually kind of downplayed her own looks and kind of referred to herself as not good looking. But in spite of that, she did not lack for male attention. She spent 2 decades with the philosopher George Lewes. They spent 2 decades unmarried because he was married when they were together. He never was able to secure a divorce. I believe he had 4 or 5 children with his wife, but they spent 2 decades together as partners. Her pen name, George Eliot, was in tribute to him, George Lewes. After he died, she married a man 20 years younger than her. She was 60 and he was 40. And it was her lawyer and accountant, John Cross. They took their honeymoon in Venice, Italy, and he tried to commit suicide on their honeymoon from jumping from a bridge. He was saved and survived. But she died only a few months after they got married. Virginia Woolf was a big fan of George Eliot, and she remarked on the novel Middlemarch as magnificent. And she said that it was the first English novel written for grown-up people. That's some pretty high praise. George Eliot, or Mary Ann Evans, grew up in a religious family. Her father was devotedly Baptist, but in 1842, she gave up the church, and her father basically told her, okay, I can't force you to believe, but at least go to church and make the image look good. And so that's what she did until his death. She was an early anti-Semite. Middlemarch has some problematic material about her attitudes towards Judaism and Jewish people, but by the time she wrote Daniel Duranda, which was her last novel, her attitudes towards Jewish culture and Jewish family changed. And part of the narrative in this novel is almost a redemption of her anti-Semitic views, and she completely made a turn in how she viewed Jewish people. And I think that's about it for what I found out about George Eliot, or some of the things I found out about George Eliot. And the last book is not a Victorian novel, but it contains Victorian characters. and it is Possession by A.S. Byatt. This is the book that I'm reading for the Barter Horde's Backlist Book Club, and this is the story of two academics in London. It is set in London, England. They are researching, it is Roland and Maud, they have partnered up to research Raymond, okay, this is embarrassing, but I forget his name, the poet. Randolph Henry Ashe is a poet that Roland is researching. And he discovers some letters that were slipped in between the pages of one of his books, which has been archived in the London Library, and he steals them. And he talks to another one of his academic colleagues who directs him to Maud Bailey, who is another academic studying Christabel Lamotte, who is a poet and a novelist. And the two of them discover that Ashe and Lamotte may have been having a clandestine love affair. So they partner up to research both of these Victorian poets and novelists. And the narrative ensues. This is kind of a book in a book because it's set in the late 80s with this team of academics and intellectuals, and they are researching these two Victorian literary characters. And the story kind of goes back and forth. A.S. Byatt wrote poetry to insert into the narrative and letters between the two Victorian academics and intellectuals. And so it's kind of a dual timeline, dual narrative setup, frequently flips back and forth in time. So it's a really interesting novel. And these are the things some fun facts about A.S. Byatt. She was born on August 24th in 1936. She's 84, I believe she's still alive, 84 years old, living in London, England. Her sister is the novelist Margaret Drabble, and they have a contentious relationship, which she has described as normal sibling rivalry, but she can't stand being asked about her sister in interviews. And so any interviewer for literary magazines or articles knows going in, do not ask her about her sister Margaret Drabble. Let's see, she was made Dame Commander of the Order of the British Empire in 1999, so her official name is Dame Antonia Susan Byatt. Byatt is the last name of her first husband. She is an intellectual and an academic. She was a professor, and she's became a full-time novelist. The children's book, one of her later novels, was shortlisted for the Booker in 2009. Possession won the Booker Prize in 1990. She and her sister, and I believe there's another sibling, a brother, had a very unhappy childhood with a domineering mother. Her mother was a frustrated intellectual, and after getting married, she lost all opportunity to continue her study and her academic training, and that may have been what led into her being domineering over her children and frustrated and extremely desperately unhappy with domestic life. And both Byatt and Drabble tended to avoid domesticity after marriage, even though Byatt had 4 children. But neither one of them took to the domestic life because they were more consumed with their intellectual studies and pursuits and their academic careers. Dame Iris Murdoch was a friend, a mentor, and a significant influence in A.S. Byatt's writing. So some pretty high-level academic intellectual friends. In 2016, A.S. Byatt had a fall and was in a coma, and she was interviewed for an article, I believe in December of 2016, and was quite frail and still recovering from her coma, but more than able to have a very deep intellectual literary conversation. And I think that's about it. A.S. Byatt is incredibly intellectual. Her novels are complex, somewhat obscure, very literary. Possession was kind of her breakout novel. Before that was published, her sister Margaret Drabble was a little bit more exposed and famous than her, but that propelled her pretty much into fame in the limelight. So those are some of the authors' backgrounds from each of the novels that I'm reading in Victober. And so far, I can't get enough. I'm reading Possession, which is probably the more complicated of the three novels. And I absolutely love the story. This is a second attempt at this novel for me, and I'm really into it now. I'm about almost 190 pages into the novel. It's complex, it's complicated. I need to be in a quiet room when I'm reading it, but I'm very much into it. It's a very slow read. Daniel Duranda, I am reading slowly with Alba, and I am also listening to the audiobook narrated by my favorite, Juliet Stevenson, who I absolutely love. She is a magnificent audio narrator. And I love this book. Alba and I think, both love it. But it's a lot of fun to read and listen to the audio at the same time. And the other advantage is when I do go into work, about 12 hours a week, I listen to the audio in the car. And then Jane Eyre. This is my own personal project. I absolutely love this novel. I'm not very far into it. 40, what am I at? I'm at 35 pages. I read a little bit last night. I love this novel. I love this story. I'm really looking forward to finishing this. This is the first time I've read this Victorian classic, and I'm really looking forward to finishing this and rewatching the movie. I started to find the series. I think there's a few series out there, possibly both by the BBC. I wasn't really happy with those. They are very true to the novel, but I did not like the production of them, so I will prefer the movie to the series, each of the series. That's it for my Victober. That's all I'm going to read for Victober, because as you can see, these are not small, thin novels, and they're not necessarily all simple reads. I'm going to stick with these three and I'm hoping I can finish 2 of them for this month. I'd like to finish Possession by mid next week if I can. That's my goal. And that's it for me. I hope you enjoyed the videos. Write a comment down below. Tell me what you think of the books I'm reading or any of the facts that I offered today about each of the authors. I'm really enjoying Victober this year, and yeah, that's about it. If you haven't subscribed to my channel, please do so. I would love for you to do that, and I will see you in the next video. Bye, everybody.